Well, hello everyone. I don't know what time of day it is when you're listening. I gather quite a lot of you just listen to the audio and use it to jog to. Then you can scream at me when you wish because you're out in the open. It's been an unusual week. First of all, however, I think I want to start with a prayer because you'll perhaps see why. The subtext of this whole episode will be the nature of embedded language. And perhaps my favourite prayer goes thus. O Lord, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid. That's just the opening sentence. I think that would be a very profitable start to church in the most noisy of evangelical churches. It sort of sets you back on your heels. You're dealing with someone who knows everything about you and still loves you. That's an astonishing thought. He goes on and says, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your spirit so that we can do two things properly, love you and serve you. Of course, even Anglicans who have that in their prayer book, most modern Anglican churches outside of places like Nigeria, I don't know what they do there, although I've been there several times, probably don't use those old words. But to have something like that embedded in your mind from childhood is an incredible gift. And to have many of them embedded is an even greater gift. Old-fashioned Anglicans, when they're dying, will be reciting the prayer book and the Psalms at the end of their life. Good evangelicals will be having favourite passages of Scripture that comfort them. Happy songs, I'm not sure they will do the job as well. I haven't seen any evidence of it yet. So think about that. It's a kind of subtext of what I'm going to talk about. So, with Sally being away, visiting her sister and mother-in-law and others, not mother-in-law, stepmother, I get it the right way around, who's now 90, I realise, of course, when she's away, how much she does, and I'm not as appreciative as I should be. But maybe I'll be better when she comes back. But that wasn't, that's the background to the week. But it's been a trip down memory lane in other ways too. As one thinks about what I liked about growing up in England and why I don't want to go back with her because I'm watching what's happening to it. And I'm appalled, my beloved profession included. The UK is losing its way, but then so are we. Because one of the other things that happened this week is a good friend, a retired professor from Virginia Tech, sent me an email describing the incredible reduction in the amount of reading people are doing in the Western world. Because, of course, when you spend time on screens, you can't then use it to read a book. And reading good books is a much better investment, I now discover. The average North American is only reading an occasional book. Even the Bible is not read regularly by most evangelical Christians. The Catholics are probably doing better than us now because they have some well-used daily Bible reading websites. We need to think seriously about this. It's a major problem. One of the other memories of the week for me was, again, from my Virginia Tech prof, an introduction to a Irish-British humorist, Pat Condell, who's been around for some time. But he sent me a link to a piece on education for dummies. He says in about 4 minutes what it would take me a lot longer to say, and I couldn't say it with the acerbic timing that he has. He's furious in a sort of sad way. That now he says, what must it feel like to be a student who sits in a class knowing that the professor is dumber than he is? Because we've had so much development of bird courses and rubbish courses and pushing aside intellectual achievement to achieve certain ideas of the intellectual elite who want everything to be fair in outcome, not even seeing that if everybody got the same outcome, there'd be absolutely no incentive to do anything. Equal opportunity as far as possible. Yes, yes, yes. But equality of outcome? You've got to be out of your tiny mind. Probably mind is so small you never had one in the first place. I don't know. But he does it brilliantly. He's Irish, born in Ireland, then works on the comic scene in Britain. So there's a little coarseness in there, but you can deal with that. But it's pushing at something that really matters, that is a recurrent subtext to these talks about what are we losing and how fast are we losing it and can it be recovered? My wife from England just sent me a clip from Peter Robinson interviewing Tom Sowell about the tariffs. And he's very sad. He says, I hope it's just a ploy, because if he really ignites a worldwide trade war, everybody will lose, because all the increase in our lives in terms of material has been very dependent upon trade, international trade. And you get rid of that, and everybody will suffer. The 1920s tried it. It's not as though we don't know what's happening. And centralization of economic decisions is the worst aspect of Marxism. Of course, Sowell doesn't talk about that there. But of course, if you really want centralized control down, as the communists tried, to the price of everything, it can't be done. How many million items are there that need their price coding done? It can't do it. The market does it perfectly. I think I mentioned in a recent one Gorbachev's famous comment to Mrs. Thatcher when he first came to Britain, and he looked at the shops, little grocery shops as well as big ones, and the incredible range of food that was available. And he said, how do you organize all this? And she replied, we don't. The market does it. But if you close the market down in so many ways, we'll all be sufferers. So I hope that it's just Trump shaking the world up. And let's face it, we in Canada in particular should be shamefaced about what we've done in one area, and I've been saying it for years. We live next door to a very big society, and the elder Trudeau said living next to the US and living in Canada is rather like being a mouse who goes to bed with an elephant, always afraid he may roll over. But the plus side of it, of course, is we always knew that if anything serious happened, the first people to arrive to help would be Americans. And we have let out our defense to the Americans, which was, well, it wasn't cowardly. We do fight when the time comes, but it was cynical. And Trump has got every right, in my view, to say to the world, you've got to bear your fair share of the burden, and we certainly don't. And 2% of the budget is reasonable. Instead, we spend our time having DEI nonsense for soldiers. Whoever could think of that? If you're thinking about that in the middle of a battle, you're going to get shot. But that's where we're at. So I hope that he just wants to shake the world up and he say, all right, guys, let's get back to trading as we usually do. And I think if he's going to shake up Canada rightly over the military, he should shake up Mexico, because they could stop the cartels with ease if they wanted to. But it brings in lots and lots of money to the Mexican economy. And if you do not fear someone who knows everything about you, to whom all hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid. If there's no sense of that in your life, then it's inevitable that the result will be bad. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I want to raise my problem next because, of course, I do try most weeks. Sometimes I forget to plough slowly and carefully through the Sermon on the Mount. We're still in the first chapter, chapter 5. But with what's going on at the moment, one of the really difficult bits is what Jesus says about the way we deal with unjustified abuse. Turn the other cheek. That is a difficult thing to deal with. One of the very hard sayings of Jesus. There are lots of cheeks I couldn't turn, if you see what I mean. But I think one has to realize that he is talking very specifically there about being under the thumb of the Romans and under the thumb of people like Matthew, who had sold out to the Romans and were abusing their own people. You can still see that in many parts of Africa where Mobutu famously would sell crossing points. You paid up in advance what he wanted, but then you got the right to run the border for whatever length of time you'd bought. And in that time, you were going to make enough money to retire for the rest of your life. And nobody could argue with you. You could charge what you wished. And they did. So we don't have any sense of it being like that. But that's what a real free-for-all would turn out to be, a power struggle. And what Judeo-Christian thought did was to change that, to give us means to do better. And so turning the other cheek, we should never get angry, except righteous anger. There's a place for that, but that's on behalf of other people, not ourselves. And of course, the long history of the martyrs shows how that can be done and how incredibly effective it is. The first thing written about Christians was, behold how these Christians love one another. That was a new idea. But over a period of centuries, Christianity won. And the Roman Empire bent the knee to Jesus, politically at least. But shortly after, they were overrun. But when that happened, what was Augustine doing? He was writing The City of God, which became the blueprint for the development of Europe over the next 1,000 years, before the next big event, so to speak, occurred. The Dark Ages were not so dark. Read Chesterton's biography of Aquinas. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So I don't think what Jesus is saying there is on the big level. It's on the personal level. He did, after all, on the big level, refer to the Pharisees as whited sepulchres, hypocrites. So he was not turning the other cheek then. He went after them. And they knew it. They perceived that he was speaking of them in the parable of the unjust, well, not unjust, much worse than unjust, the vineyard minders who wanted to be the vineyard owners and killed the king's son. They understood what he was saying. So this is another example of how the Sermon on the Mount works as you go back now and look at yourself. And have you allowed yourself to be drawn into petty squabbles that should never happen, which are illustrated even in the last chapter of Philippians, where Paul has to write and say, tell those two women to get their act together, basically. Obviously, it's some sort of petty squabble going on, and hopefully it was settled. We all do it. I remember years ago in the main connecting corridor for all the wards at St Thomas's Hospital in London, where I was working at the time, And my boss met another guy, and they chatted for a minute or two, and then he said, my boss, who was a nice guy, and knew this guy was not, and he said, you see, and he mentioned the name of a guy who's just got the position at Hereford. And the other guy, he was angry. He said, if I'd have known, I'd have stopped it. He had that kind of power. The British caste system was very powerful, very subtle, very nasty, very vindictive and unforgetting. And that's a bad system altogether. So you've got to realize the world in which you live, and you've got to start thinking about how you work it out. It's not an accident that Paul puts gossip next to murder in his list of the really destructive sins in Corinthians. So, where do I go from here? Well, where I go from here is to start looking back at the good part of my education, going to high school and finding my home master spoke 5 languages. Language is always worth acquiring. I wasn't good in that area. I was exposed to it. But languages were hard work for me. I came from a working class Birmingham with a thick Birmingham accent at that stage, which I got rid of for cultural reasons. People judge you by your accent in Britain, so I changed mine. That's not disrespectful of the working class background. It's just, in my view, a matter of being reasonably precise. But I remembered things from school. The masters wanted you to learn. There were some of them who were into the easy default of dictating notes that you had to memorize for the exam. That was happening even then. But at least it usually had some interesting illustrations. But I had one English master who knew that little boys aged 11 were not going to be interested in English literature unless he could bring it to life in some way, and he did it brilliantly. He made us actually want to be able to recite poems like The Story of the Revenge and Admiral's All. Not the best poetry in the world, at least Admiral's All is Newbolt, but little boys love it. Any of you who've got 11-year-old boys nowadays, they'll get a diet of DEI and male chauvinism, and you should be feeling guilty for what your forefathers did. A whole load of nonsense. What little boys need is to know what courage is and what patriotism is. They are good things. They are needed to make a society work. I mean, in Admiral's All, Newbolt gives in each stanza a different major naval battler. Howard was fretting in Cadiz Bay with the galleons fair in sight. The admiral at last give him his way, and the word was passed to fight. Never was schoolboy gayer than he, since holidays first began. He tossed his bonnet to wind and sea, and under their guns he ran. Now, there's 5 stanzas like that, different battles. Little boys took to that. We liked him. And in the process, he taught us why poetry worked, why it was important to know what commas and the like did. He taught us English. He taught us to savour the language. We learnt some major speeches, like John o' Gaunt's speech about the Emerald Isle, and all the usual ones in Shakespeare. Now, and a lot of scripture that was taken for granted. Now there's no scripture in Little Shakespeare. And of course, if you don't know the Bible, Shakespeare is difficult because it's full of allusions to the Bible. And yet ordinary people went to the Globe and listened to his plays because they could. He communicated with them, obviously. And one of the ways was to use the phrases they already knew that brought with them a whole shorthand for telling you something about the characters. And of course, they did have silly nonsense about there being no such things as bad people. We are all the products of our choices. You become what you do. Jesus, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, ends it by saying, "What shall I liken the man who hears my words and does them?" He's the one building on the rock. It's not about conversion at that point. It's about the Christian life. And the one who doesn't hear my words, he's the one building on the sand. And we're seeing that. When the American experiment began, it was unique in the history of the world because America had been settled by multiple pieces. The current Aboriginals in Canada were not the first people here. They wiped out a lot that came before them, as we now know. And just along the road from our farm, there's a place where you can pick up flint arrowheads. There were multiple clashes there and murders. Their culture had stayed where it was because it hadn't had the gift that set ours going. The real question for us to ask is, how come these things happened? And that too needs a lot more thought. And I'll come back to it again this week. Let's think, what's her name? There's a lovely, wonderful Jewish woman. First name is Melanie, and I've forgotten for the moment her second name. But she was, for many years, a classic liberal Jew working for The Guardian. Melanie Phillips, that's right. And she had no interest in going to Israel. The Guardian was an extremely liberal paper, which I read in those days. Lost its way completely over time because no depth. And it wasn't until October the 7th that Melanie Phillips was woken up. And she's now just published a book on why the West is collapsing and why only Jews and Christians can save it. I'm going to read that book. I only learned that it's come out this week. But I've been following her and seeing that she changed and was becoming more and more aware of her own cultural history. She hasn't yet got as far as, say, Neil Ferguson, who I've watched also and knew years ago when he published Civilization that he was on track to change, because in that book he did all the liberal appropriate things at the beginning, and 2/3 of the way through the book he goes to China, and there he finds people who paid by the government to find out why the West has succeeded. And both groups that funded by the government came to the same conclusion. We thought it was your economy, we thought it was your army, we thought it was this, we thought it was that. It wasn't any of them. Now we're quite convinced the reason you succeeded is your religion. And what they couldn't understand is why we were trashing it. And we're paying the price because we have lost it. My good friend David Jeffrey, now retired from Baylor, from whom I bought my farm, which was his. He went to China, was an honorary professor in the English department of Beijing University for more than 10 years. And he went to teach them how to understand the metaphors of the English language, because they'd worked out that early schooling stories were important in the development of the West, the heroes that we acquired along the way. But they couldn't recognize the metaphors. So the first lecture, introductory lecture he gave with the Communist Party on the platform, was about the Bible in English literature. And they wanted him back year after year. Astonishing. Astonishing. That's what happened. Metaphors, for us, you see, my hero, Daniel. Does that surprise you? Of course not. But we knew these stories so that single lines could bring a whole story back at the time when your memory was at peak performance, not your organization abilities. For guys, they don't learn restraint until they're in their mid-20s in many cases. The frontal lobe doesn't switch on. Again, last week I was listening to a young woman on trigonometry who's on a journey of the same sort. And in the discussion, she says, yeah, I realized that our culture included restraint, and it's necessary. And she went on, quite honestly, to say, that's what women do for men when the culture makes it the way it should go. And she said, it's obvious, isn't it, that the most promiscuous group in our society are homosexual men. Nobody else comes close to them because there are no restraints in that world, and they pay the price in the long run. What women do is civilize men. Told all three of my daughters, your primary function in life is to civilize at least 3 men, if possible. And they're doing it. That's the way we were made. You know, your genesis, the satisfactions that come to you come from that prayer at the beginning, that we may rightly love and serve you. So, a lot to think about there. Lots of little loose ends, which will be undoubtedly picked up again as we go along. One of the next things that happened last week, I was asked for the first time in my life, actually, to go and speak at one of the larger evangelical churches. In fact, I think probably the largest evangelical church in Ottawa, to their retired people's group, an old codgers group, we'd call them in England, but they're more less pointed accounts there. There were a lot of, over 100, I think, and they wisely had about 20 minutes just sitting around talking to one another. They arranged the lecture in a room where they were sitting around tables, and so there were a few refreshments and some coffee, and after about 20 minutes, my turn came along. And the guy who was running it said, tell us about your family and your life story to begin with. And I never got beyond that. And we went on longer than usual, but they were with me. You can always tell when you're losing an audience, and the only thing to do then is to move on as quickly as possible and bring it to a close because you've lost. But that wasn't the case then. And there were some interesting conversations that followed from it. And I hope more will come out. And one of the beauties of the amount of travel I've done is that every now and again you get a little reminder that you don't know what you're doing. But if you have done your homework, and then I think if you're speaking as a Christian apologist, for want of a better term, I would reduce what I was going to say. For 10 points will make an hour, but that will include multiple little rabbit trails and then coming back to join the main path again. But I was talking to a good friend on the phone this week and heard from him for a while because his wife is in the process of going through Alzheimer's. And I had stayed with his son in Moscow, Idaho. And he said, you probably didn't notice, but you really made an impact on my grandson. Thank you. He said he was following you around. He didn't want to miss anything. That's good. That's good. And who wouldn't enjoy that? If you don't enjoy that, there's something wrong with you. And you don't want pride because in one sense, I've had my reward for that one. Maybe it would have been better to wait for the New Jerusalem. I don't know. But it does remind you time and time again that we don't know what we're doing. That's why we trust. The most extreme version of that to come up this week, which I came across, was Helen Roosevelt being interviewed on a Christian channel in Canada that I don't listen to. It came up on YouTube in the shorts, and I suddenly saw Helen Roosevelt's face. Now, Helen Roosevelt, she's written a lot of books, usually with life in the title, but she was a very smart woman, somewhat older than me, so she must be 90 now. And she went to university, got a first-class degree, and went straight off to Africa as a WEC missionary, where the couple who prayed for me every day for 30 years were given the task of civilizing her, because a woman who's got a first-class degree from Cambridge and qualified as a doctor, she thought she knew how to do everything, and they had to calm her down. But at one stage during the Simba uprising, she was captured by the Simbas, brutalized, raped, and she gives an account of how the presence of Christ was nearer to her at that point than he had ever been before or since. And he simply said, "Once I gave my life for you. Will you loan me your body for my purposes now?" And she knew what was going to happen. And she said, from somewhere, I found the strength to say yes. And in that incredibly dangerous situation, she said, I was suddenly overwhelmed by an incredible sense of peace. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. It is incredibly moving. And she recovered from it. She was gang raped, and she came back. She was rescued. She came back to England, recovered incredibly quickly. I won't get off track there. That'll come up some other time, because the way that was used, even that she could see, apart from many other ways, was astonishing. And so she, a woman who looked like a missionary, and therefore when she went to universities at first sight, looked like an easy target for the liberals, and almost invariably they would ask, Dr. Roosevelt, do you have anything to say about the crisis we have with rape on campus? Thinking she, as an unmarried woman, would be entirely unable to answer the question. And of course she would say, strange you should ask that question. And she'd have many of their audience in tears as she told the story of how her God, her master, can be trusted. Astonishing witness that she's had. So, what we're doing to the universities is destroying the culture. What it used to do was to give you a grounding, whether you liked it or not, in some important things, which would come back to you at various times during your life. But now, as Pat Condell, the Irish-British comedian, puts it in his wonderful 4-minute piece, Universities for Dummies. I mean, we are so unethical in the universities. All universities know that in first year, in fact, at admission time, there are people they ought not to admit, but they do, and they take their money for a year or 18 months before they drop out. They get nothing for that money, except a sense that they've failed, instead of being directed to what would be more useful to them. But we don't do that. And then we start adjusting the results to fit what Tom calls the elitist vision, the vision of the anointed, who, having no sense of an overarching God, look upon everything as a social construction. So if you don't like it, you whine about it and then try and change it. And in the process, you lose competence. Not good news. And not only are we losing competence because of that first prayer again, we're losing trust. One thing that the Trump administration has already done beyond any doubt is demonstrate the incredible corruption of the political management, perverting funds to their own uses, to their own agendas. The Rainbow Coalition are totally amoral in this respect. Good is defined as what advances the Rainbow Coalition. Evil, anything that doesn't. It's a disaster. I mean, they've got to the stage now where they're brutally honest about it at one level. A year or two back in one of their marches, I think in Washington, the Pride marches, they came and the song for the year was, "We're coming, we're coming, we're coming for your children." They could do that in public so blatantly and nothing happened. And yet other people, grannies who happen to say something absolutely true, find themselves being prosecuted under hate speech. Lost. So it can only be good that this stuff is brought out into the public arena, but the next step is going to be much harder. Why do some people do this and others not? And again, I urge you to read David Stove's Darwinian fairy tales, because this is the revenge of the Darwinian fairy tales. If you are the product of time plus chance and have no ultimate meaning, and if it is a battle of the genes, then where does morality fit into that process? It doesn't. It cannot be produced that way. There is no rational route. As Lewis put it a long, long time ago, we castrate and bid the gelding be fruitful. Wow, that's a pretty vigorous metaphor. What's he talking about? He's saying for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem of human life was how to conform ourselves to the will of God. And the solution was virtue. For the modern man, the cardinal problem of human life is how to subdue reality to our desires, and the solution is technique and truth, particularly moral truth, has vanished. The same is happening in the law courts, and you're seeing that as well. And I'm amazed how few lawyers I meet who've ever read Arthur Leff's incredible 1978 lecture on justice at Duke, where he says, what we want, heaven help us, is to be simultaneously perfectly free, defined as doing what we wish, and perfectly ruled. Can't have both. Of course, freedom is not defined as getting what you wish. Acton put it much better than that. He said, let me see how far I've gone. He said that freedom is not the freedom to do what you wish, but the freedom to do what you ought. And how does that come about? And can you bear witness to it? You ought to be able to. There ought to be changes over time that people recognize. Usually in my case, they say, you have mellowed, to which my wife says not much. But that's, I know what they're talking about. It's true. I am at peace, not because of anything I've done, but because of the life into which I have been drawn. I mean, the ultimate aim is to be able to say, as Paul said, the life that I now live is not mine. It's Christ living in me. And every now and again you meet somebody who obviously has made that progress. John Stott was like that. Martin Lloyd-Jones was like that. Along the way, I've been privileged to meet a few people who give you that sense without saying a word. Whose, again, the Anglican prayer book, whose service is perfect freedom. Because only as we face the reality that we are creatures, that we are fallen creatures, and that we need help, and that God's plan for us is that he intends to live with us forever. That's hopeful. That's what I hope will come out of the move towards some sort of administrative honesty, which will raise the issue that Vogel recognized way back in 2000 that without transcendence there can be no justice, and trust is nonsense. But without trust, we cannot live. I mean, if we did not serve the same God, our marriage would not have lasted nearly 60 years. But we both made a promise in church, which by the grace of God, we intend to keep. Have a thoughtful week.